Tonight's program is Agricultural Hatfield. And the idea for this program came to me a number of years ago after I was contacted by the Reporter newspaper and asked to put together some information on agriculture in Hatfield for a community guidebook. So after doing the research for the Reporter, I thought that perhaps the subject might make for an interesting community program. So tonight we're going to look at the transition of Hatfield from the agricultural community it once was to the residential, commercial, and industrial community that it is today. The dictionary defines agriculture as the science, art, or practice of cultivating the soil, producing crops, and raising livestock, and in varying degrees the preparation and marketing of the resulting products. For most of its 280-year history, agriculture has played an important role in the lives and the livelihoods of those who have called Hatfield their home. It wasn't until 1730 that the first Europeans settled on the land that would become Hatfield Township. They came to this area by way of an old Native American Indian trail that would eventually become the Bethlehem Turnpike. They settled in this area somewhat later than in other neighboring townships because, frankly, the land here just wasn't that great. The swampy, flat nature of the forest that covered much of the area, along with the hard red clay soil, made this area less hospitable and less suitable for cultivation than the surrounding areas. And any of you who have tried gardening in true Hatfield soil are familiar with the clay nature of the ground here. Early settlers certainly had their work cut out for them. They needed to clear the land of trees, which were then used to build their homes, remove the stumps, and then it no doubt took early farmers a good number of years of tough work in the hard clay earth to transform it into productive, fertile, growing soil. For those early settlers, farming provided them with the essentials of life. They raised poultry and livestock and crops to feed both their animals and their families. Some farmers would grow cash crops. They would increase the size of their farm so that they would have more produce than their family needed, which would then be sold for profit. In the 1800s, Hatfield Township farmers, like farmers in much of Montgomery County, benefited from the relative close proximity to the large and growing city of Philadelphia. It was a long, slow ride, though, to the city by horse and wagon over the rough Bethlehem Pike. Excuse me. That changed in 1857 when the Pennsylvania Railroad Company completed construction of a railroad line through the open fields of Hatfield Township. And with a station placed in the township, it was a great advantage to the cash crop farmers of Hatfield, allowing farm products to reach the city quickly and cheaply. Speed of delivery was, of course, quite important in transporting perishable agricultural goods back in those days. The railroad station, located almost in the center of the township, where the tracks crossed the Cowpath Road, also made it convenient to receive shipments of feed, lime, lumber, and general supplies used in an enterprising agricultural community like Hatfield. Early Hatfield farmers did well with hay and grain crops such as corn, wheat, and oats. In addition to farming, a good number of agricultural-related retail businesses also thrived in early Hatfield. An 1871 map of Hatfield Township lists two of the larger ones. Comely L. Jenkins was listed as a merchant of feed and flour in the village of Calmert. And as you can see, at that time, the Calmer train station was called Line Lexington Station. Mr. Cumley was also a patent manure merchant as well, whatever that means. And there's also Isaac R. Culp, listed as a wholesale and retail dealer in flour, feed, and baled hay. Isaac Culp owned a 24-acre farm on South Main Street. His farm comprised all of the land between Lincoln Avenue and Chestnut Street, and from Cowpath Road, which of course is now Main Street, all the way back to Maple Avenue. Here are a couple of early advertising postcards for Mr. Culp's business, stating that he was a dealer in flour, feed, and coal, and that long and short-cut hay were his specialty. Quite a peculiar choice of artwork for these postcards, though, I think. But here's a more traditional advertising postcard for Mr. Culp's business. Notice that this colorful postcard states that he paid the highest cash price for hay. In fact, Mr. Culp eventually discontinued the feed and coal aspect of his business to specialize in hay and hay baling. In fact, in 1878, he obtained a patent for his technique of inserting a board into the hay baling press in order to make 2 half bales rather than a whole one. Despite the patent, his technique was apparently copied quite freely, and Mr. Culp spent a lot of his time in court litigation trying to get royalties from his invention, but apparently to no avail. In 1884, George S. Snyder, an ambitious young entrepreneur, also entered into the profitable business of hay and feed by starting his own business in South Hatfield, just across the tracks from Isaac Culp's business, joining the ranks of those engaged in agriculture-related businesses. He eventually added a grain mill to his operation, and by 1904, George Snyder was producing Excelsior brand cornmeal products under the name of Hatfield Cereal Mills. It's interesting to note that this sale was made to I.C. Detweiler, who was operating a general store at that time in Danborough, Bucks County. 4 years later, Mr. Detweiler would sell that store and buy one right here in Hatfield at the corner of Broad and Market Streets. This is a nice colorful paper sack that once held Snyder's granulated yellow cornmeal. And this photo, granted not the best quality, was taken around 1905 inside the George S. Snyder granary mill and shows 3 employees and a young boy posing with bags of Snyder's granulated Excelsior yellow cornmeal. And this buckwheat flour sack from Snyder's Hatfield Electric Mills is probably from around 1915. And both of these sacks that I've shown you are currently on display at the Hatfield History Museum, but only for a short time yet, so be sure to schedule your visit to the museum before the end of the month to see the George Snyder display if you haven't yet done so. So, those are a few of the larger agriculture-related retail businesses that thrived in Hatfield around the turn of the century, that is around 1900. But by the end of the 20th century, increased demand by Philadelphians for milk and milk products had influenced the transition from crop farming to dairy farming for many southeastern Pennsylvania farmers, including those in Hatfield. Some grain production did still continue in Hatfield, but it was mostly to feed the dairy cows and other livestock. To get milk to the Philadelphia market, special milk trains, like this one seen here, would make daily trips from Philadelphia to Bethlehem, stopping at stations along the way to pick up the fresh milk from the local dairy farmers. In 1903, the Pennsylvania State Secretary of Agriculture, speaking of Philadelphia, said, "The immense milk supply required to meet the wants of this great city gives the milk dairy a very prominent place among the farmers of this section," referring to southeastern Pennsylvania, "and some of the most finely equipped dairies to be found in America are located here." In 1908, the Lehigh Valley Transit Company began a trolley freight service using converted passenger cars similar to the one seen here. With a trolley station located in Hatfield Borough, this gave local Hatfield farmers and agricultural-related businesses yet another option for speedy delivery of their products to the city and other communities. Here's William Fretz on the Hatfield trolley station's freight platform, waiting for the next freight trolley to arrive. And he's got a shipment of George Snyder's Excelsior cornmeal sitting there on the platform waiting to be loaded. In the background, of course, is the former George S. Snyder Mansion, now a part of the Paradise Manor assisted living facility. In 1925, William F. Rosenberger purchased George Waite's milk route and started Rosenberger's Dairy on his Bergy Road farm, seen here. In 1936, the business was moved to 40-foot Road and Coffle Road, as seen here. The Rosenberger's Dairy was a larger dairy farm and processed and marketed their own dairy products. Another one of Hatfield's larger dairy farms was the Hohen Brothers Dairy Farm out on Coffle Road. John Hohen bought the former Abram Allebach farm in 1910, and after his death, the farm was sold to his sons Albert and George Hohen in 1929. The Hohen brothers continued to operate the dairy farm until at least 1944. It appears that the farm was discontinued by around 1948 and sold to the Hatfield American Legion around that time. Of course, Hatfield had a large number of small-scale dairy farms as well. Smaller dairy farms generally didn't process and market their own products, but they had a number of different options of how to sell their milk. Some took their milk to the train station each morning to load onto a Philadelphia-bound milk train. Some sold their milk to a large local dairy for processing, like Rosenberger's or Martin Century Farm in Lansdale. And others joined a local dairy cooperative called a creamery, who would buy the milk. There were two creameries that met this need in Hatfield toward the end of the 19th century. The oldest was the Calmer Creamery, established around 1884 on the Bethlehem Pike in the tiny Hatfield Township village of Calmer. John Holly, who you can see lived just south of the creamery at this time, owned the creamery business from 1886 until 1925. This is a photo of the Calmer Creamery taken in the early 1900s when John Holly was the owner. I believe that the building to the left was the creamery's ice house, as it appears that that is an ice elevator at the edge of the pond, which would be used to lift ice blocks cut from the frozen pond up to the ice house for storage. And this is how the creamery looked around 1940. Notice all the milk cans in front of the building. John Summers, who purchased the creamery from John Holly in 1925, was the owner at the time of this photo, around 1940. One former dairy farmer related to me how he would normally sell his milk to the Martin Century Farm dairy in Lansdale, But occasionally his cows would get into a patch of wild garlic, which would, of course, affect the milk. Martin Century Farms would refuse to take it, but he said that the Calmer Creamery was always happy to take his garlicky milk. He didn't know what they did with it, but perhaps they used it to make garlic butter. Anyway, the Calmer Creamery continued operation until at least 1954. The other creamery that operated for a time in Hatfield Township was established by Frank Howe on his 76-acre Guernsey dairy farm. Howe had purchased the former John W. DeLong farm, located at the corner of Cowpath Road and Orvilla Road, in 1895. The creamery continued here until around 1914, when Howe sold the farm. Here's an aerial photo showing most of Hatfield, taken in 1938. To get oriented, that's Cowpath Road going through Hatfield, and that's the railroad going up through the middle of the picture. We can see that, with the exception of the borough, located almost in the middle of the township, most of Hatfield is wide open farmland. And even the borough had a lot of open farmland at this time. And by the way, that oval to the left of the borough is, of course, the Hatfield racetrack. So let's take a closer look at some of the old farms of Hatfield. Now, it would be impossible and probably not very interesting to talk about all of Hatfield's farms, so I picked a few you might find interesting. And first, we'll look at the old Munsinger farm down on Cowpath Road. This is a closer look at that 1938 aerial photo showing the 36-acre Munsinger farm, which was right across Cowpath Road from the current Heidelberg Church and just a short distance from the Hatfield Church of the Brethren. This farmhouse dated back to at least 1870, and notice the long lane leading from the barn to the fields. This photo shows John Munsinger raking hay on his Cowpath Road farm, taken around 1902 as he approached the age of 80. Excuse me. John Munsinger was born in Germany in 1825, and at the age of 23 survived a stormy 3-month Atlantic crossing and arrived in Philadelphia with just the clothes on his back, 5 extra shirts, and 25 cents. He came to Hatfield Township, where he managed to get work on local farms. He worked for the next 15 years as a farm laborer and shoemaker, earning about $5 a week. John Munsinger finally gathered enough money to buy his own farm in 1863, just a few hundred yards south of the Hatfield German Baptist Brethren Meeting House, now the Hatfield Church of the Brethren, where he was a charter member. And that's John standing there outside the church. And that's Cowpath Road running there along this side of the fence. This picture from around 1902 shows a crew hard at work harvesting hay from the Munsinger farm. That's John Munsinger's eldest son, Frank, in the foreground, forking the hay up to a Swiss hired man, while 6-year-old Samuel Munsinger, barely visible behind the hay, piloted the horses down the rows. In 1905, John Munsinger sold the farm to his oldest son, Frank. Remember that long lane I pointed out in the aerial photo of the farm? This 1920s photo is looking down that long lane from the barn out to the farm fields. It's a great picture taken on a foggy morning. Here's Frank Munsinger with his horses, Bill and Dick, as they pull a plow through the field. Unlike most farmers, Frank kept his horses until they either died of old age or illness. And here are his horses as they roll a newly seeded field. Farmers would pull heavy rollers through the fields after seeding to compact the soil around the seeds to help make moisture and nutrients more available to the young plants. In this 1923 photo, Frank Munsinger is placing fly netting on his horse Bill in preparation for a day of harvesting hay, while his other horse Dick awaits his turn. Even though gasoline-powered tractors became smaller and more affordable in 1917 with Henry Ford's mass-produced Fordson tractor, many Hatfield farmers continued to use horses for field work throughout the 20s and well into the 30s. A few didn't even get around to buying a tractor until after World War II. And here are the Munsinger men and horses hard at work harvesting the hay. In farm life, the simple chore of feeding the chickens and ducks usually fell to a youngster. And on the Munsinger farm in 1923, that meant it was young Richard Munsinger's job. Whatever chicken, duck, and eggs whatever chicken, duck, and eggs the Munsinger family didn't consume themselves, Frank would take to market in Lansdale every Friday. He also carried with him the family's excess butter, which was churned by the boys, and cottage cheese, which was whipped up by Frank's wife, Catherine. And here's Sarah Munsinger in 1923, fetching water from the backyard pump. Sarah was Frank and Catherine's youngest daughter and stayed and worked on the farm long after her siblings had married and moved away. Frank Munsinger's steadiest source of income was from the sale of milk from his herd of a dozen long-horned Ayrshire cows. He sold the Ayrshire milk, which was extra rich in butterfat and so better for babies, to Hebner Dairies in Lansdale. Frank Munsinger farmed his land until his death on Christmas Eve, 1954. A brother and sister continued to reside in the old homestead for 3 more years when the 34-acre property was sold to the Hatfield Highway Home for the Aged. The Highway Home, which owned and operated a facility in the former George S. Snyder Mansion, had plans of building a new facility on the Munsinger property, but for some reason, at some point, they abandoned those plans to build at this location. The farm remained intact until around 1969, when the old farmhouse was demolished and the farm field developed, including what is now Cindy Lane and Creek Road. Although the old farmhouse and barn are long gone, the old Munsinger tenant house, where the hired farmhands lived, still stands there on Cowpath Road across from Heidelberg Church. A stone's throw away on the other side of Cowpath Road, Frank Martin had a relatively small 12-acre farm. The farmhouse that still stands today dates back to around 1862, when it was built by carpenter Tobias Oberholzer, who lived there. This picture of the Martin barn and a hired farmhand is from 1909. Frank Martin and his wife Nellie devoted some of their farm to raising some not-so-typical farm animals. Wolfhounds, operating under the name Zenovia Kennels. Nellie Martin even wrote a book, The Russian Wolfhound, published in 1931, an authoritative account of the breed. Around 1893, John D. Stout moved his wife Maggie and his growing young family from Ambler to this 96-acre farm in the village of Treewigtown, Hatfield Township. They brought with them a small herd of cows, driving the animals for 9 miles up the dusty Bethlehem Pike. The house itself was located on the east side of Bethlehem Pike, right about where Advance Lane is, which is just north of the Red Cedar Grill, or for you long-timers, where the former in-flight restaurant was. The Stout family, which included 10 children, operated this general farm for 27 years before moving to the village of Calmer, a half-mile to the south. And for those of you who knew Carolyn Stout Ziegler, this was her family home. And that is Bethlehem Pike, just behind the rail fencing seen there. In the late 1800s, Jonas Castle owned a farm on Funk's Road. Again, using this 1938 aerial photo, this is 40-foot road coming out of the borough towards Welsh Road, and this is the former Funk's Road and Fairgrounds Road. So that's the Castle farm. After Jonas Castle died, his administrators sold the farm to Henry Hackman in 1912. In this 1924 photo, Henry's 15-year-old son, Arthur, is cultivating his cornfield under the observation of Raymond Harmon, who was the superintendent of agriculture at the Hatfield Joint Consolidated School. Every student enrolled in the school's agriculture program was required to raise a crop on at least 1 acre of soil, keeping track of all relevant statistics such as time, expenses, and crop yield. Arthur took over his father's farm in 1938 and continued to farm the land until around 1978. The Clemens Food Group, parent company of the Hatfield Packing Company across the street, then purchased the farm and eventually developed it. Today, the former Hackman farm looks something like this. Two large commercial buildings on New Clemens Road, the ShopRite supermarket, a strip shopping center with a pizza pub, and another building at the corner of 40-foot and Clemens Road, home to a Dunkin' Donuts and an urgent care facility. But fortunately, the old 1876 farmhouse still remains, being used, I believe, as an office for the Hatfield Quality Meats. The Bishop family had a long history of farming here in Hatfield. Daniel Bishop purchased his first Hatfield farm, located out on Bethlehem Pike, just north of Orvilla Road, back in 1887. In 1902, he also purchased the neighboring larger farm of John Clymer on Orvilla Road. That farm also held one of Hatfield's oldest farmhouses, a log structure built in the mid-1700s. After Daniel's death around 1935, the Bethlehem Pike farm went to son Wilson, while the larger farm went to son Harry. Wilson Bishop continued farming the Bethlehem Pike farm until the 1970s, when he sold the property and the farmhouse was demolished. Harry Bishop's family continued to work the larger farm on Orvilla Road until 1985, when the property was conveyed to son Richard. Richard and his brothers Daniel and Lester continued to operate a dairy and crop farm on the land until it was sold in 2008 to Keystone Church. In 2014, the church finally moved forward and produced plans to develop the property, which included the removal of the old log farmhouse. Interest was expressed by some in the community for preserving the house on the property, and the church indicated that it would give the community time to see if funding could be obtained for the undertaking. While some efforts were made to turn the house into a historic resource for the community, these efforts were not successful, and the building was finally dismantled in February 2018. And for now, the farm sits empty. Right next door on Avila Road is the former Ridgedale Farm, which name goes back to at least 1871. Clarence and Lavinia Carvoth bought the Ridgedale Farm in 1935 and moved into the old farmhouse on the property. Clarence, a career accountant, operated a dairy and poultry farm on the 40-acre property. He also raised horses on the farm. Son William, at the age of 7, began helping his father out on the farm, and in 1945, at the age of 18, William began operating a meat and poultry route in Chestnut Hill. Later, Clarence attempted to farm his land, but he was not very successful, due mostly to the swampy nature of his land. This photo of the Ridgedale Farm is from around 1940. In 1952, son William convinced his father that he should convert the farm into a 9-hole golf course. Building the course became a part-time passion for both of them, all the while continuing to hold down other jobs. The course, designed by William, or Bill as he was known, was finally completed and opened to the public around 1961. From that time on, Bill devoted all of his time to the golf course, which of course continues to operate today. This is the former John Bolton farm out on Unionville Pike. To orient you, this is Unionville Pike heading out to Route 309, and this is where North Penn Road now is. John Bolton started working his farm around 1910. This photo, sadly not the best quality, shows John Bolton getting ready to rake his fields. And here's the Bolton farmhouse, barn, and other outbuildings. Back around 1750, 160 years before John Bolton farmed this land, and long before this farmhouse and barn were built, the land was part of a 359-acre plantation owned by Daniel Rosenberger. When Daniel died in 1771, the plantation was divided between his two sons. Son David received this portion of the plantation and built a house here in 1780. He carved out a date stone with his initials, DRB, standing for David Rosenberger, and the year 1780. In the mid-1800s, when the present farmhouse was built, David Rosenberger's date stone was preserved in the cellarway of the new home. That 240-year-old date stone is now mounted to a garage wall next to the old farmhouse, and hopefully will someday be part of our museum collection. In the early 1970s, the former Bolton farmland and a number of other farms in the area were purchased and developed into the Line Lexington Industrial Park. But fortunately, for now, the old Bolton farmhouse still remains. Here's a great early 1940s photo of Hatfield Borough and the township beyond. One of the farms in the borough at that time was the Schlosser Farm on Talmenson Avenue. Their 4-acre farm included the land from Telmenson Avenue, across Broad Street, and up to the racetrack property. And there's some open farmland where Wayne Avenue and June Drive will be built. Another early 1950s photo showing lots of farmland in Hatfield Township to the east of Hatfield Borough. This is the railroad heading north, and there's the Hatfield train station. And there is the former Chester Knight farm property that stretched all the way from Maple Avenue back to School Road. In 1969, the farm became home of the Hatfield Village Apartments. This 1940 photo shows 2 Hatfield Township farms on Elroy Road near Fairgrounds Road. The Durstein family owned both of these farms since 1909. The upper farm buildings were eventually demolished to make way for the Penfield Manor Apartments. The Dursteins kept a herd of about 30 dairy cattle, mostly Holsteins with a few Guernseys thrown in to increase the butterfat content of the milk, and they sold their milk to Rosenberger's Dairy just down the road. To feed these cows and the farm's lesser livestock, Wallace Durstein raised a standard crop trio of hay, corn, and wheat. This is Wallace and his son, Wally, see him in the back there on the combine, harvesting a field of hay in 1948. The meat and produce raised on the Durstein farm that wasn't needed to feed their large family of 12, they would take to market to sell. The farm's pigs and chickens eventually wound up, in one form or another, at the Durstein stall at the Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia. The Dursteins also sold produce, including onions, lettuce, rhubarb, string beans, and sweet corn from the family's large farm garden. This is a 1954 picture of Wallace and his daughter Ruth at the Reading Terminal Market stand. Here's a nice color photo from 1956 of the Durstein farm, taken from out in the farm fields behind the house and barn. And here's a photo from around the same time showing the Durstein women folk doing beans under the shade of a large tree. Here's Luke Durstein around 1975 out in the field checking on a young calf and its mother. Wallace Durstein died in 1979 and the farm passed to son Wally, who continued to farm the land with his brother Harvey. Here's the Wallace Durstein farm in 1938. And that's 40-foot road, Fairgrounds Road, and Elroy Road between them. In the mid-60s, a large piece of the Durstein farm was sold to the North Penn School District to build the Penfield Junior High School. Then in the mid-70s, the Dursteins built the Watershed Dairy Farm, or the Watershed Farm Dairy Store, on part of the property. And around 1995, the rest of the farm was sold for the construction of the Windsor Hills development. And this is what the former Durstein farm looks like today. But thankfully, the old farmhouse, which was built around 1830, still remains. Here's a 1992 aerial photo of the northern edge of Hatfield Township. That's Cowpath Road in the front, Durstein Road on the left, Elroy Road at the top, and the Hatfield-Franconia Township line on the right. And that's the Natale farm farmhouse and the barns. Stefano Natali purchased this farm, which lies in both Hatfield and Franconia townships, in 1935. And this is a great aerial photo showing the Natali farmhouse, barn, and numerous outbuildings. Here are the Natali brothers, Frank and Angelo, in front of their farmhouse, which was built around 1840. The impending construction of the Route 309 PA Turnpike Connector Road through the middle of their farmland was too much of a challenge for the brothers to overcome, so they sold the property to a developer, and in 2006 the old farmhouse was demolished. Their farmland is now filled with the houses of the Westport Farm Development. Another old farm on this piece of Hatfield Township is the former Miniger Farm, and that is the old Miniger Farm at the top. This farmland was also sold to a developer because of the proposed connector road. But fortunately, the farmhouse was saved because it has a very interesting history. Back during the Revolutionary War, this farm was owned by John Johnson. After the American Continental Army was defeated by the British in the Battle of Germantown on October 4th, 1777, the sick and wounded were brought north, taking refuge in many of the farmhouses of the area. And John Johnson opened his spacious home to many of them. Several wagon loads of the sick and wounded were brought there, along with a nurse to take care of them. According to a more recent owner of the house, bloodstains were still so visible on the third floor that he had to have the wood planks replaced. Johnson and his daughter Fanny assisted in attending to the wounded and sick, some who had the typhus fever. It wasn't long before word came, although falsely, that the British were heading their way. This caused great concern, as you can imagine, and so all of the sick that could be moved, along with all of the doctors, fled west to Berks County. Johnson and his daughter stayed, however, to care for the sick and wounded who could not be moved. Shortly afterward, both father and daughter were stricken with the dreaded fever, and in just a few days, John Johnson died. Fanny suffered terribly from the illness for a long time, and there were no doctors in the area that could attend to her. Her whole body was so stiff that no limb or joint could bend. Her friends constructed a crude stretcher on which they carried her all the way from Hatfield to the doctors in Berks County so that she could receive medical attention. She suffered a long time but recovered against all expectations, dying many years later in an advanced age at her home near Doylestown. So it was certainly nice that the old Johnson farmhouse with its interesting history was saved and the development was built around it. Again, this is what that area looked like in 1992 with all the farmland and after the farmland was developed. And it won't be long now before the Route 309 Turnpike Connector Road will be squeezed in between the houses right along the Hatfield-Franconia border township line on the right. And the other wide swath of open land going right up through the middle of the development is the Pico Power right-of-way. Quite uniquely for this area, tiny Hatfield Borough remained home to a large working farm up until the year 2000, the former Allebach Farm. The history of the Allebach family farming this land dates way back to 1852, when Joseph Ruth sold his 52-acre farm to David M. Allebach. And as you can see, the map maker didn't quite get the name spelling correct that year. In 1875, the farm passed to David's son, Abraham C. Alabach, who passed it to his son, Leidy, in 1912. This circa 1915 photo of the Alabach family working to bring in the hay is the only known photo of Abraham C. Alabach. I believe that's him in the back. To his right is his son Leidy, and the two boys are Leidy's sons, Abraham G. on the wagon and Raymond G. to the right. And here's the Alabach boys taking the loaded hay wagon into the barn. And that's Abraham G. on the wagon and Raymond standing on the right. In 1937, the farm passed to the fourth generation Alabach, Raymond G. Here's Raymond posing with the farm's bull. And here's Raymond working his field around 1950, still using real horsepower. In this 1950s photo, you can see that it was still quite a large farm, about 2/3 of it being in the borough. Some of the land later became the Village Scene mobile home community, operated by two of Raymond's sons, Raymond Paul, who went by just Paul, and James. Another part of the farm was sold to Brooks Instrument, located on West Vine Street. Also in this photo is Rosenberger's Dairy that we discussed earlier. Raymond Alabach died in 1989, and the farm passed to his son, Paul, the fifth generation. In this 1992 photo of Alabach's farm, you can see the Village Scene community and some of the adjacent land that has been sold to Brooks Instrument. And that's Talmenton Avenue, going through the bottom of the picture. Although this circa 1995 picture isn't very sharp, it's the only one we have of the old Alabach farmhouse. This is a view of the farm buildings from Talmenton Avenue with their cattle grazing in the meadow, which contain apparently quite a bit of heather growing in it. It was not uncommon on quiet summer nights to hear the sound of cows mooing throughout the small borough. This is a view of the farm buildings as photographed from Alabach's spring-fed pond. I'm sure some of you have memories of fishing or ice skating on Alabach's pond. In the late 1990s, after 148 years of the Alabach family farming the land, it was sold to a developer. Before the land was cleared, almost by accident, it was discovered that the old Alabach farmhouse was actually a log house built around 1760 and in excellent condition. The logs were all marked by a preservationist, and the house was carefully disassembled with hopes of rebuilding it at another location in the future. The former Alabach farmland is now home to the Heather Meadows community and Hatfield Borough's Heritage Park. It is interesting to note, though, that a part of the 250-year-old farm still survives on the property. It is located, somewhat hidden by landscaping, right next to a walkway connecting the development with the Heritage Park. There you will find a piece of thick plexiglass covering a hole in the ground, as seen here, and a plaque that reads, "The surrounding land was part of a tract purchased from William Penn in 1705. It was farmed by 5 generations of the Alabach family from 1852 until 2000. This hand-laid stone well is 25 feet deep and dates from the mid-1700s. It has been preserved as a historical reminder of the original settlers and following generations who lived and farmed here. So sometime stop by and check out this unique bit of history located in this modern housing community. Farming on a smaller scale produced a couple of successful greenhouse businesses here in Hatfield. In the village of Orvilla, there were actually two competing greenhouse businesses right next to each other. This again is a 1938 aerial photo of the village of Orvilla. This is Orvilla Road and Coffle Road. William Sturzbecker bought a 6-acre parcel in 1891 where he built a house and also had a greenhouse business. The property was eventually sold in 1919 to Herman Afjes, a name that may be familiar to some Hatfield long-timers. He operated the business for many years under the name Orvilla Grove Greenhouses. Meanwhile, on land adjacent to this greenhouse business, George Didden established his own greenhouse business in 1914 in partnership with a Mr. Sitter. That partnership didn't work out, and Didden ended up selling his business in 1921. This second greenhouse business operated at Orvilla as Orvilla Greenhouses. So you had the Orvilla Grove Greenhouses and the Orvilla Greenhouses right next to each other. I don't have any detailed information on the ongoing history of these greenhouse businesses, but the buildings stood well into the 1990s before the land was sold for development. The most notable greenhouse business in Hatfield, though, has to be the George Didden greenhouse business. And as I just mentioned, George Didden had started the greenhouse business in 1914 in Orvilla. After selling his Orvilla business in 1921, he established a new greenhouse business on West Vine Street near the railroad crossing in Hatfield Borough. In this 1941 picture of the greenhouse business, you can see that there is a lot of open farmland in the township at the top and quite a number of smaller plots being farmed in the borough. Over the years, the Didden business has grown to include 32 greenhouses with about 3 acres of production area. And they are currently looking to expand their business even more in the near future on land across Vine Street. George Didden's 3 great-grandsons, Ken, John, and Dan Ruck, now own and operate the wholesale-only business, making Didden's the oldest family-owned business in Hatfield. And next month, they celebrate their 100th anniversary of business in Hatfield Borough. So congratulations to Didden's. The Lund Brothers Nursery on Cowpath Road is a long-time family business here in Hatfield. Hidden pretty much out of sight from the road, they've been in business on this 8-acre parcel since 1972. Mostly a wholesale business, the nursery provides garden centers and landscapers in the Bucks and Montgomery County area with quality ornamental trees and shrubs. They do, however, sell retail all summer at the Lansdale Farmers Market. In 1992, Browse Landscapes moved from Collegeville to an 8-acre farm off of Durstein Road, where they started growing specimen nursery stock. Then in 2003, they also established a tree nursery in Hatfield on leased land between Funks Road and Clemens Road. They continued to operate on Funks Road land until recently when the property was cleared for the construction of Hatfield Quality Meat's new smokehouse facility. A new type of farming came to Hatfield in 1985 when Gary and Janet Haig started a Christmas tree farm on their 40-foot road property across from Penfield School. In 1992, they purchased an adjacent property, doubling the size of their choose and cut Christmas tree farm to over 3 acres. And there have been a number of other Hatfield businesses that have focused on growing and selling trees in Hatfield's past. I'm sure a few of you folks must remember when Ben Moore had a nursery business on Cowpath Road just north of the borough. And perhaps you can think of others as well. In addition to farming, there were those in Hatfield who earned a living in the agricultural field, focusing not on growing crops, plants, or trees, but by raising and selling of livestock and poultry. And being 2 days before Thanksgiving, it's quite appropriate to remember that time back in the early 1900s when Hatfield was famous for its turkey auctions. The turkey auctions here were so big that Hatfield was given the nickname Turkey Town. When the first turkey sales were held here in Hatfield in the late 1800s, the birds that were auctioned off were mostly raised here on local farms, like this large Hatfield turkey ranch. But around 1900, an unknown disease killed many of the young turkeys being raised on the local farms, frustrating the farmers who decided to stop raising turkeys. This forced the turkey dealers to go out of state to obtain their turkeys. Joseph Anders and Milton Benner, seen here, were the two most famous Hatfield turkey dealers, earning them both the title of Turkey King during their careers. Turkey auctions continued in Hatfield Borough, selling mostly out-of-state birds, until 1928. By then, trucks had become quite dependable for hauling turkeys, so turkey retailers were now able to buy directly from the turkey farms in the South, cutting out the auctioneer middleman. And so Hatfield's days in the limelight as the turkey hub of the East came to an end. Pork processing, of course, has played a vital role in Hatfield's economy for many years. And it began back in the late 1800s when two competing pork processors opened businesses across the street from each other. John M. Funk established the J.M. Funk and Company pork packing business out on the western edge of the township on a dirt road between 40-foot Road and Durstein Road that would eventually bear his name. Across the street, David N. Castle was conducting his own pork packaging business on his father's farm that he called Hatfield Packing Company. In 1921, John Funk had an artist come in to sketch his business in operation for a newspaper advertisement for Funk's high-grade country pork products. And that's John Funk, second from the left, and it looks like his employees are busy at work making sausage. The following year, Funk's pork business went bankrupt, and it was eventually bought by the Hatfield Packing Company across the street. In 1946, the Hatfield Packing Company itself was purchased by the Clemens family, who had lost their Pleasant Valley Pork Packing Company plant in Mainland to fire. The Clemens family grew the business, now named Hatfield Quality Meats, to where it is today, Hatfield Township's largest employer and the 16th largest employer in Montgomery County. In addition to poultry and pork, beef was also a pretty big business here in Hatfield for a time. Of course, many of Hatfield's farmers have raised beef cows over the years, but one turned it into a full-fledged business, Arthur Baum. It was in 1944 that Arthur Baum purchased a large Hatfield Township farm on 40-foot Road. The property also had one of the oldest farmhouses in Hatfield, possibly built around 1770. Sitting way back off the road down a very long lane, it was easy to not know that the farm buildings were even back there. Here's a closer look at the 250-year-old farmhouse. After buying the farm property, Arthur Baum started a business, raising and processing beef, Baum's Meat Packing. In the early years, in addition to beef, he also processed veal, pork, and lamb, but in later years, he focused on beef. Here's another view of this farm as it appeared in 1938 before Baum purchased it. That's 40-foot road and Welsh Road. And that's the farm. And here's the farm more recently. You can see all the beef processing buildings there. The business continued until around 2005, and as I'm sure most of you know, the Baum property, the largest remaining parcel of Hatfield farmland, was sold recently to a developer, and work has started to construct a 375-home development on the 96-acre property. Another long-time livestock-related business in Hatfield was the Hatfield Livestock Auctions, which operated for many years next to the Hatfield racetrack. The livestock market had its beginnings in the early 1930s as a horse auction held adjacent to the Hatfield racetrack, which at that time was primarily a horse racing track. The market later expanded into the auctioning of all sorts of livestock, and crowds of area farmers frequented the market, looking to both buy and sell. Oh, this bullet-shaped pencil advertising piece was from a time when it was operating under the name Hatfield Fairgrounds Bazaar. And you can see that they sold dairy cows every day and butcher stock on Mondays. The Hatfield Livestock Auction held its last sale in 1969, and that's auctioneer Frank Geyer Jr. taking bids on the last day of sale. In the early 1950s, a trend began where people started moving out of the city of Philadelphia to the quiet outlying suburbs. Population growth in suburban Philadelphia proved to be a double-edged sword for farmers, however. While it created an increased need for farm products, developers were also offering unbelievably high prices for open land. In this 1950s photo, farmland has been replaced by houses on Berge Road in Hatfield Township, as well as Oak Road. And soon more would be built on Beach Street, and that's Diamond Street on the left. And there's Ben Moore's nursery that I mentioned earlier. As the population rapidly increased in Montgomery County, so also did the need for more public services, with the accompanying property tax increases, of course. These increased taxes made it even more difficult for farmers to make a profit, giving them even more of an incentive to sell their land. Also, throughout Montgomery County, farmland was being condemned for public improvements that were needed due to the rapid population growth. In 1930, a creamery and 51 dairy farms were closed in Skipback when their land was condemned for the Graterford prison. Then the construction of the northeast extension of the Pennsylvania Turnpike in 1954 gobbled up even more of Montgomery County's farmland and often divided them. No program on agriculture in Hatfield would be complete without briefly discussing the Montgomery County Fair that was held in Hatfield at the Hatfield racetrack and adjacent livestock market grounds. It operated from 1925 until 1941. In August 1925, members of the Hatfield Driving Club, that's the folks who organized the horse races at the racetrack, they collaborated with the Montgomery County Farm Bureau to bring the Montgomery County Fair to Hatfield. The next month, the first Montgomery County Fair in Hatfield was held at the Hatfield racetrack. The inaugural fair opened September 15, 1925, and according to newspaper accounts, there were agricultural exhibits galore. In fact, it was more elaborate than anything held before in the county, with an entry list so large that 6 additional secretaries were engaged to assist in compiling the records. And this photo shows the water wagon at that first fair. There were so many entrants in the dozens of contests 2 years later, in 1927, that judges needed an extra 2 days to award the hundreds of prizes. Some of the categories included grain and hay, vegetables, flowers, poultry, and many, many others. In 1940, in the pig category alone, 49 4-H pig club members showed 103 swine. And this is Ethel Detweiler of Collegeville, who took first prize in the Pen of Pigs category. And those are some nice-looking pigs. And here are some cattle that were exhibited that year, 1940. Another feature during the fair was the livestock auctions, which many folks look forward to each year. After a final fling in September 1941, the county fair was suspended because of World War II and never really restarted. A half-hearted attempt to revive the fair was made in the 60s, but it didn't include the agricultural aspects of earlier years and so wasn't very successful. Farming in Hatfield Township continued to prosper, remaining the backbone of its economy until the 1960s, when the suburban sprawl housing boom finally reached the area. With each passing year, more of Hatfield's farmland began to grow houses, apartment complexes, industrial manufacturing plants, and commercial shopping centers instead of crops. Just within the last few years alone, Hatfield has lost over 190 acres of farmland to development. Although it's been part of the Lexington Industrial Park for many years, this 26-acre parcel along Route 309 has been farmed until just a few years ago, and now a new warehouse is under construction on the property. Ground clearing operations began earlier this year on the former 35-acre Walter Farm at Cowpath and Township Line Roads. The farm, which had been in the Walter family since 1908, will soon be filled with 65 new single-family homes. And over near the Hatfield Quality Meats plant, this 32-acre parcel that was leased to the Browse Landscaping and Clark's Landscaping businesses was cleared this year, and a new smokehouse facility for Hatfield Meats is currently under construction on the land. And as mentioned earlier, the 96-acre Baum Farm is currently under development. So, what farmland is left here in Hatfield? Well, there's not much. The largest remaining farmland in Hatfield is this area here, around 100 acres, immediately adjacent to the former Baum farm tract. And there are still a number of other small pockets of farmland scattered around the township. But the endless fields of soybeans and the endless rows of corn